Hi everyone, and welcome to the last video for our theories of perception. You'll remember we've gone through direct realism, indirect realism, and last time we looked at idealism, which is the theory from Bishop Berkeley. And it's a bit quirky, isn't it, to say the least? It's claiming that all we have are mind-dependent ideas. And actually we're rejecting the idea of an external world. So we're talking about objects only in terms of them being a cluster of sensations and ideas in our minds, rather than existing out there in the world. How could there possibly be any problems with this theory? So 3 issues we have to cover here in this video. We're going to look at arguments from illusion and hallucination. We're going to look at the idea of solipsism and also the problem with the role played by God in Berkeley's idealism. It doesn't make complete sense. Right, now let's think about what Berkeley is claiming. So he is saying that perceptions are simply ideas. So things exist when we are perceiving them. So to be, remember, is to be perceived. Esse est percipi. But what happens then to objects when there's no one there to perceive them? So what happens to my bedroom when I'm not there in the daytime? Does it stop existing? So Berkeley's idealism seems to imply that things only exist as bundles of ideas in the mind. So if no one's there perceiving them, they do not exist. And this seems to suggest that objects, as ideas, they pop in and out of existence, which seems absurd. This is all about a problem that we call the problem of continuity. How do we know, or how can we have the idea that objects continue when we're not perceiving them? So a good example of this is to have the concept of a fire. You light a fire, it gets going, you leave the room, and for the idealist then, basically, surely that fire ceases to be when you walk out of the room and you stop perceiving it. But when you actually walk back into the room, the fire is there. And actually the fire has dwindled a bit. How do you explain that? So how can idealism account for the process of continuity and change? Okay, cinema example. So there you are, you go to the cinema, you're watching a film and you pop out to the toilet. When you return, the film has moved on. So it implies that the film has continued even though you were not perceiving it. Okay, how can idealism explain this? Now, Berkeley's solution is simple. God is the permanent perceiver. And this idea has been summed up in quite a famous, is it a limerick? There was a young man who said God must find it exceedingly odd when he finds that the tree continues to be when no one's about in the quad. Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I'm always about in the quad, and that's why the tree continues to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. So Berkeley's reply to the criticism of continuity is, there is an all-powerful God who is the permanent perceiver of all possible ideas. So by perceiving everything when no person or other animal is perceiving them, Berkeley's God ensures that physical objects retain the kind of continuous existence that we tend to think and common sense says happens. When I leave my bedroom, the things in my bedroom continue to be until I return to my bedroom. But it's not the fact that these objects exist in the world, it's the fact that these objects exist as ideas in God's mind when I'm at college. So ideas are perceived by God, and God ensures continuity. God's very busy. So have a go at this then, please. Okay. Right. So, are we happy with Berkeley's use of God, or does it pose particular problems? Have a think. Okay, well, I'm hoping that you will think that what might be a problem is that God might not exist. Now, this is a fair point, but it's not one, really, that the examiners really want you to dwell on, because it's not the key idea. There are many more issues with this than God's existence. So one of the main things that we're going to be looking at is that God's attributes or characteristics, such as being perfect and unchanging, this kind of role does not fit with that, with this sort of nature. And there's another point as well. It goes against Berkeley's own idea that we cannot conceive of anything beyond our minds. Remember, that's what he said. Nothing exists, or we cannot, know of anything existing beyond our minds, and then suddenly we've got God. So why does Berkeley use God in this way? Well, Berkeley thinks that it's a no-brainer, that God must exist because God is the only possible explanation for how regular and persistent and consistent our experiences are. Okay, now think about this. So Berkeley thinks that ideas, they have to belong to a mind. And it's clear that some of the ideas that we have are not willed by us, the things that you wouldn't want. So, the idea of my children's messy rooms, it's something that I could do without, and I certainly wouldn't will. So these ideas must come from something beyond us. But these ideas, thinking about them, they seem to be regular and consistent. Certain things stay in the same place. We can agree to meet other people, maybe, meeting up with friends. So my idea of meeting at 10 o'clock seems to match with your idea of meeting me at 10 o'clock. So there's regularity and consistency, isn't there, in the ideas that we have. And Berkeley thinks that this can't possibly be caused by, these ideas can't be caused by inanimate objects, such as, beds and clocks, as these don't have the power to cause ideas. Inanimate objects don't have any power. They can't do anything. And ideas need to be caused by something active, something that can make things happen. So ideas need to be caused by an active power. So ideas must be caused by a very powerful mind. This is the only real explanation for how regular, how consistent our ideas are. It's got to be God. Got to be, according to Bishop Berkeley. But I just want you to remember that we've, this premise that it can't be caused by inanimate objects, we've challenged that before with Descartes. So this competition between, is it objects or is it God, is a theme, actually, that we've looked at a few times. Right. Okay, so we know why Berkeley is saying that God is involved. But the big problem with saying God is involved is the nature of God. Now, next year we'll go through the nature of God. And God is said to be a being without a body. So God is said to be immaterial. And God is said to be omnipotent, so all-powerful. So with that in mind then, how can we explain God having certain ideas of sensations, feelings? Because surely to feel something, you'd have to have a body, okay, and, nerves. So just taking pain, for example, then. So following the argument, our perceptions are in the mind of God, says Berkeley. But pain is a perception. So pain must be in the mind of God. But if God feels pain, then God is not perfect. Pain is a lack of perfection. So this contradicts the nature and idea of God, doesn't it? Okay, so Berkeley does answer this in the dialogues that we've looked at before between Philonous and Hylas. And basically, he says that God doesn't experience pain, not in the same way that we do. So God does not suffer pain. God has knowledge of what this pain is like because God has all knowledge. God is omniscient. God knows about these ideas, but doesn't experience them the way we do because God doesn't have a body. Okay, so now, even if this is the case, so we could say that God doesn't experience certain sensations, doesn't experience pain, so maybe God can still be omnipotent. But there is a problem. There's another problem. And it's this. We feel pain and then we might take a couple of paracetamol and that pain might go and then it might return, and 4 hours later we might take more paracetamol. But this idea of pain is changing hour to hour, minute to minute. And God is said to be immutable. Now, immutable means unchanging. So how can God have the idea of something that is changing when God is unchanging? So it seems to be a contradiction. Okay, and remember at the beginning we said that there is another problem with using God. Okay, so it's as if it can't get much worse for Berkeley. But we've said that Bishop Berkeley has told us that nothing exists. We cannot conceive of anything existing beyond our minds. Do you remember the tree that Hylas said that he thought he could conceive of, but actually he was conceiving of it, so it was mind dependent? How can we now assert the existence of God as something other than an idea in our mind? Okay, so it seems to be that Berkeley has forgotten the limits of what he can claim that externally exists. Right? Okay, let's move on from God. That's your God bit done. And we're now going to look at the idea of solipsism. Okay, now solipsism is a lonely old thing. Solipsism is the idea that only my mind exists. And since Berkeley insists that we can only know something exists if we perceive it, then it must be true that I can only at most know that I have a mind. I cannot know that anyone else has a mind. So I only have direct access to my own ideas. I have direct and privileged private access to my ideas, and I cannot be sure that there is anything more than my ideas and my mind. Therefore, I can only be sure that my mind exists, and this is a state of solipsism. So the realization that it could only be me that exists, talking to myself. Okay, so we could say that idealism seems to lead to solipsism, the idea that only my mind exists. But actually, Hume puts the boot in even further and says, Berkeley, how can you even say that you know that your mind exists? Surely all we are ever aware of are ideas. Now, we have come across this objection before. Okay, so it seems to be that Hume is challenging Berkeley to provide two arguments here. One, to show that a mind exists, and then that other people's minds exist beyond my own. So firstly then, Berkeley needs to establish the idea of a mind and the fact that ideas belong to minds. So it could be that idealism only establishes the certainty of ideas. But Berkeley argues, and I think quite sensibly, that a mind is actually needed, as minds are the active agents that create ideas. Ideas are not substances. Ideas are properties that belong to substances like minds. So Berkeley argues that a mind is needed, as minds are the active agent in receiving ideas, and ideas are passive. So a mind must exist. So there we go. Berkeley has established that at least I have a mind. Okay then, so Berkeley seems to have dug himself out of one hole. Now he needs to dig himself out of another and establish the existence of other minds so that we can escape solipsism. And this is the way he does it then. So he says that all ideas are caused by some mind, because ideas are passive and minds are active. So I experience ideas that are independent of my will. So sometimes I hear people saying stuff to me that I don't want to hear, or I see people doing things I don't want them to do. And these ideas that are independent of my will, they wouldn't be things that I wanted, must be caused by a mind other than my own. Okay, because I wouldn't will them, I wouldn't want them. So therefore, a mind or minds other than my own must exist. Okay, now I don't know whether you're satisfied with those responses from Berkeley. I think you need to give the responses that we're looking at some thought, because I would find it highly unlikely that you would side with Berkeley on his theory of perception, on idealism. So do think as we go along. But finally then, we're going to look at this problem, the problems of hallucination and illusion. And we've seen these throughout the theories of perception, and we've looked at how hallucinations and illusions might be explained from direct realism, indirect realism. But it's particularly tricky, isn't it, with idealism? So if all objects are ideas or clusters of ideas, how can we possibly know which ideas are real and which are hallucinations and illusions? Is there any way of knowing? Because everything's just ideas. So at least with realist theories, we could call upon the real, external, objective object and say that in some way these hallucinations or illusions are different to that object. But, you know, realists can say about illusions, they can say that when what's going on in our mind, our sense data, mislead us about mind-independent objects, that explains what's going on, or that an object's relational properties might make things appear a certain way. And that's why illusions happen. So we can tell the difference between an illusion and a real or veridical perception. And remember, realists can explain hallucinations by saying, actually, there is nothing existing in reality that is a perception. The hallucination is something different to an object completely. But let's look at the bottom here. But everything, according to idealists, is mind dependent, isn't it? So everything is an idea. So how can there be any difference between a real idea and an unreal idea? Can there be? This seems to be really, really problematic for Berkeley. Well, Berkeley does respond and says, okay, immediately you wouldn't know. There would be no way of differentiating between the idea in our minds of an illusion or hallucination and the idea of a real sensation. So there would be no immediate way of working out. But there is a way, because we can differentiate between them by what we infer from them. So let's say I have the idea of an oar in water and it appears bent. Okay, so I have the idea of seeing this bent oar. Then my inference would be that if I touched that oar, it would also feel bent. But when it doesn't feel bent, I can judge the difference, can't I, between a real sensation and an illusory sensation. Okay, so that we can differentiate between a hallucination and real from what we're inferring. So right down the bottom again, if I see an ice cream floating before my eyes, then I would infer that I could reach out my hand and touch it. But when I can't touch it, I can then differentiate between a real sensation and a hallucination. So actually, this is going back to an idea we saw with Locke, and it's about the corroboration, isn't it, of the senses. So this is the corroboration of ideas. If my ideas match each other, then that's real. But if they don't match each other, then that's going to be something like an illusion or a hallucination.